Oh, hey, welcome back, everybody. I've spent the last year reading Stephen King's Dark Tower series, and I finally finished. And as you can see, it's quite a hefty load. So I thought we could talk about it a little bit. So as regular viewers will know, I have sort of a love-hate relationship with Stephen King. I used to read a lot of his books when I was young, and I got very frustrated with some of the weaker ones, and they actually were making me angry, so I stopped reading him for years and years and years. And I kind of got back into him a couple years ago with The Colorado Kid, which I quite liked, and some of the adaptations, the movie adaptations of his books that had been coming out got me more interested in him, and a friend recommended that I read the Dark Tower series, and I've always been kind of interested in it. The title is very evocative and intriguing. It's a long, epic series, which I tend to like some of those. And so I thought I'd give it a shot. And I started reading it in December of last year, and I finished reading it December of this year. So let's get into it. The first book in the series is called The Gunslinger, and it's the shortest, and it was written like 40 years ago, almost 50 years ago, in the 70s, I believe. And it's been an epic. It's been spanning King's entire career. Last book was written, I think, in 2003. So 30 years in the making. And it's quite an epic. You know, the epic word is used so much. It's so overused. It's a word we really should reserve for what it actually means. But this is appropriate in this case. The Dark Tower series is an epic. The back quote on the back cover describes it as a uniquely American epic, and I think that there's a lot of truth in that. So I want to get into some of the things I liked about it, the things I didn't like about it, and some of what it's about. Basically, it's a quest story. It's an old-fashioned, you have Roland the Gunslinger is the main character, and he's on a quest for the Dark Tower. And it's sort of a mysterious quest. It's not really clear what the stakes are starting out. It's not really clear why he's on the quest. It's not really clear who's trying to stop him or what they have to gain from doing so. And that's sort of a theme throughout the whole series. There's a lot of kind of murkiness about the plot and what's actually going on. And you can say that it adds to the mystery of it, or you can be frustrated by it. I kind of like that you don't really ever know what's going on until the end. And I don't think Stephen King did either. He's sort of a fly-by-your-seat-of-the-pants writer. He doesn't really revise or rewrite too much, although I think he did rewrite some of the first novel to make it coincide with the later stuff later on. But he just kind of goes with what he feels and what his instincts tell him. And so it's a little bit chaotic in that sense, but it's certainly an engaging read. If you read the preliminary material, the forewords, the introductions, King is heavily inspired by a couple of sources. He's inspired by The Lord of the Rings, which I am a huge, huge fan of. And he's inspired by the Robert Browning poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which I had not really been familiar with. It's actually in the appendix of the last book, so you can read it. It's quite an obscure, weird poem, but it's an interesting one. And he was inspired by that, and it really shows. If you are familiar with The Lord of the Rings, you will pick up many, many references to it throughout the course of this. There are tons of parallels between The Lord of the Rings and this story. There's a giant spider. There's the Dark Tower is obviously a parallel to Barad-dûr and Minas Morgul. There's a riddle competition, which is a parallel to The Hobbit. There's a steward who has been guarding something who doesn't want the rightful owner or the king to take over. There's all kinds of parallels. They're all scattered throughout the whole book. And it's very interesting to kind of pick those up along the way and see how Tolkien was such an inspiration to King. And while it's not, a direct copy of The Lord of the Rings by any stretch of the imagination, it has its own story and is completely different. There's certainly a lot of parallels you can draw and a lot of things you can see that are similar between those two stories. But King's inspiration is not limited to Tolkien. What I find really interesting about this book is that it's sort of a encyclopedia or compendium or synthesis of a lot of pop culture over the last 100 years or so. There's so many references to other things. There's Wizard of Oz is in there. Like I said, Robert Browning's poem is in there. Star Wars, Harry Potter. There's references to all kinds of fiction. And this is where it sort of gets into the metafiction aspect of it. And King, in the afterword to the last book, says that he hates the term metafiction and finds it snobby and academic, but there's not really another word for it because there's an interesting interaction between the world that we know, the real world, and the world of fiction in this book. And he plays with that a lot, and he kind of ties those two things together in the idea that things that we write about or things that we create in the creative arts can become real in a certain other world. There's like time travel, there's parallel universes. It's a very deep and confusing and odd storyline that has a lot of twists and turns throughout. But despite all these twists and turns, at its heart, it's an old-fashioned quest story. And it also blends genres in a very interesting way. Stephen King is known as a horror author. This is certainly not a horror story or horror book, although there's elements of that towards the end. It's kind of a mix of like westerns and fantasy and science fiction and adventure. He's definitely inspired by old westerns. The Magnificent Seven is another reference that I didn't mention that comes up a few times throughout the books, and a lot of other westerns as well, I'm sure. I'm not that familiar with the western genre, so I'm sure there's a lot of references to westerns that I'm not getting in there. But yeah, he just kind of took this stew of all this American pop culture, or English pop culture in this case of the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, that had inspired him, and he just stirred it all up in this big mess of a story that's very complex and winding and weaving and goes all over the place. So that's really cool. I think that it's neat. I mean, it's the kind of thing that if I had written, I would probably think this is unpublishable because it's too referential and it's got all these other things, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it's too self-indulgent. But it really does work, and I think it's a really engaging and interesting story. And it's the kind of thing that I think if a lesser writer than Stephen King or someone less famous than him had written this, it might have a hard time finding a publisher. But publishers have enough trust in Stephen King to let him experiment and do something wildly different from what he usually does. And the other thing that's worth pointing out is it's also, in addition to kind of American pop culture and all these influences that I talked about, it's also a synthesis of all of King's previous work. And I'm probably not familiar with a lot of it enough to really speak on it too much, but there's certainly other references to King's work, and there's references in other works that King has written to the Dark Tower series. They all kind of tie together. He said he was trying to kind of unify his body of work into one universe here a little bit, or multiple universes, since there is a kind of multiverse concept present in the book. So there's references to Salem's Lot, there's references to It, there's references to lots of different King stories that he's written over the years. And like I said, I'm sure there's a lot of them that I haven't read that I'm not picking up on, but they're definitely in there. And that's really interesting. And I will say that this is a little bit of a spoiler, I guess, but I think it doesn't think it spoils too much. Stephen King himself ends up being a character in the novel. And that's really weird. It's a crazy thing that the writer of the novel is in the novel as a character. Pretty wild stuff, as Johnny Carson used to say. So I want to start off with a list of things that I didn't particularly like about the books, and then we'll move into a more positive direction and talk about things that I did like about it. So, like with all Stephen King books, they're not perfect. They're a little bit flawed. There's things to criticize about, and that's certainly the case with The Dark Tower. It's sometimes a frustrating read for Stephen King because he's so good in some ways and so engaging, and you enjoy his work so much, but yet he does things that just drive you nuts. And that happens a lot in the Dark Tower series. So the first thing that I didn't really like is the characters, which it seems like if I'm going to read 3,000 pages of novel, I'm going to have to be engaged with the characters. I kind of didn't love any of the characters in this book. I think their dialogue comes across as a little bit cliche. He writes in dialect sometimes. There's an African-American woman who's a big part of the book, and he writes her in dialect sometimes, which is a little cringy, I find. I don't really like that. Dialect can be used effectively, but here it just came across as stilted and weird. I didn't really like it, and the characters I found a little bit obnoxious, and there was a love story between two of the characters that I really didn't buy. I didn't really think that it made sense to me. I couldn't really see those two characters falling in love with each other in such a quick way that they did. So character work is maybe not King's strongest suit when it comes to writing. He's better at plots and things like that. Speaking of the plot's a bit of a mess too. If you're looking for a straight linear narrative, this is like a spider web. It's all over the place. It's got little channels and tributaries all over the place. It doesn't go in a straight line. It can be frustrating to follow, and I think there's a lot of fat in it. I think there's a lot of kind of excess ideas. This is sort of a thing that is a recurring theme with King as well. He's got so many ideas, they're kind of bursting over, and he tends to throw them all in. He doesn't have a good editor to cut some of these things out, and sometimes the plot can get confused by just having too many different things going on at the same time, and you kind of long for a more straightforward narrative. So that's a little bit frustrating as well. He has a tendency to do a little bit of deus ex machina sometimes to resolve problems in his plots, and that's sort of a writing no-no, and he kind of excuses it in a way, the way he works it in. It makes sense within the story, but I found it a little bit frustrating that it's like suddenly characters would just have magical powers, or someone would sweep in out of the blue and save them from their situation that they're in. And sometimes that was a little bit unsatisfying as well. And then the last thing that bothered me, which I'll get into more when I get into the individual books, is I felt like he was stalling at a certain point. Like he didn't want to resolve the story, and so he was just killing time, treading water until we got to move on to the next thing. And I'll talk about that more in the individual books, but that annoyed me as well. I wanted to get to the point. So that's the negative out of the way. Those are all the things that bothered me about the book, and now I can move on to what I really liked about it. Point number one that I really liked about it is it's a great world building. It's just like such an interesting universe that he's created here, and it's actually more than one universe. It's a multiverse, and the way everything connects together, all these different fictional narratives and fictional universes kind of connect together, I found very interesting and engaging, and I wanted to know what happened next. He's good at that sort of thing. So as an epic goes, you got to have it set in an interesting universe, and he does that for sure. Next, King is very good at like suspense and keeping you on the edge of your seat. When he's on, he's really on, and you're like flying through the pages trying to find out what's going to happen next. He's really good at that sort of thing, and especially in like books 2 and 3, I think he really has you on the edge of your seat wanting to know what's going to happen next. He's very good at that. The next thing I liked about it is that because he brings in all these other ideas from the real world and from other worlds of fiction that we're familiar with, it has sort of a feeling of reality to it that a lot of books don't have. And I don't mean that in the like it's realistic and like what happens is realistic or the circumstances are realistic, but it feels real. I don't really know how to put this, but you know, there's an in-depth nature to the writing that makes you feel like this could actually happen. Like this is something that, you know, and King kind of represents himself this way a little bit. Like he's the scribe. He's the one writing down what happened instead of making it up as he goes along. And I think part of that is the interlacing of all these different narratives and all these things we're familiar with, but it has a real feeling of reality to it that I really liked and really kept me engaged throughout. And then the last thing is that you just don't get too many kind of like epic quest stories anymore. And I think that it's considered a bit of a cliche and a little bit derivative, and people don't like to do them anymore. But there's a reason why they're classics, and like the earliest fiction that we know about is like the Odyssey. It's a quest story, and they're classics for a reason. People like those kind of stories, and I like that he has brought that back in such stylish form and said, here's an epic quest like the Odyssey, like the Lord of the Rings, like Harry Potter, and we're just going to go down this road and see how it goes. And you know, it's a journey that is fun to take along with the characters, and you want to get to there. You're rooting for them. You want to solve the quest. You want to get to the Dark Tower. I think that's great. And so I like people who are willing to stick to traditional forms and reinvent them a little bit, but not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Not say, well, there have been too many quest stories. I want to do a story about a miserable pauper dying of starvation. I hate that kind of stuff. I like epic fantasy. I like quest stories. I like this stuff. So I was really appreciative of that. So that's like the main things that I really liked about the books. All right, next I'm going to do a rating of the individual books to let you know which ones I liked best and which ones I liked least. I think it's a little bit uneven, like all of King's writing. Some parts are better than others, but let's just go through and say my favorite ones. My favorite book in the series was the second book, which is called The Drawing of the Three. This is where I feel he really picked up the story and had things going at a rapid clip, and we're introduced to some new characters that are going to stick with us throughout, and we're introduced to some new mechanics of the world, and this one I was really excited to find out what's going on. I really love this one. This is what got me hooked. After the first book was a little bit mediocre, the second book is what got me hooked and had me committed to finishing the rest of the series. My next favorite one is number 2 on the list is The Wastelands, which is the third book in the series. Continuing on from the second book, just keeps that pace right on going. This is the one that has the big riddle competition in it, which is very exciting. And there's a lot of just really cool stuff in this one. I love this one. It kept me on the edge of my seat throughout, and I couldn't wait to find out what happened in the next book. This was my second favorite book. My third favorite book was book 6 in the series, Song of Susanna. I'll get into why we skipped 4 over 5 when I get to those, but this is, I think he really refound the thread of the narrative here, and this is where it starts kind of moving towards the end. We're getting some resolutions of some of these plot ideas that have been stretched out over the last few books, and we're kind of hastening towards an ending, and that's pretty exciting. So I got excited reading this one. It made me, after kind of taking a little bit of time off from the series and being a little bit bored with it, I picked back up on book 6, Song of Susanna, and really enjoyed that one. My fourth favorite book in the series was the last one, The Dark Tower, which has the ending in it, of course. This one is very long, and I feel like the first half of it was a little bit bloated. There were a little bit too many ideas. They're a little bit confusing. What's going on? Get to the resolution. Get to the final conflict is what I wanted to get. So that could have been trimmed a little bit, I think. But I found the rest of it, the second half of the book, very good and very satisfying. So I approve of this one. Fifth in the series, I liked the Gunslinger, which is the first book in the series. This one, I didn't love it when I first read it. I thought it was weird. I didn't really understand what was going on. It's a much more confined narrative than the other ones, and it's written when King was like in his 20s, written when he was very young, a long time ago. He's still trying to figure out what this story is. It's much more of a Western than the rest of the series is, and it kind of takes place in one place a lot more than the rest of the series does. I didn't really know what was going on yet. It's also the thinnest book in the series. It's definitely got some good ideas and starts the journey in an interesting way, but it didn't grip me the way that the second and third books did. Next is the fifth book in the series, Wolves of the Kala. Again, this is a little bit of a stalling book, I felt like we were kind of treading water. The characters spend the entire book in kind of one location, kind of waiting for something to happen. And I found it boring. There's a dialect that the locals of this place speak that I found a little bit annoying. I didn't like that too much. And I don't know, I just after all these pages, all these thousands of pages, I felt like he needed to move forward more rapidly and figure out what's going on with the rest of the story instead of just hanging around in this location. I didn't like this one that much. And then my least favorite book in the series was number 4, Wizard and Glass. This book, the entire book, is an extended flashback from the point of view of the main character, Roland, to what happened before the events of the Dark Tower series. And it just feels like a stall. It just feels like wasting time. We're not moving forward with the story. It's all a flashback. I don't really care about the characters in the flashback. They're not people that I've become invested in. I want to know what's going to happen on with our main characters moving forward in the story. And this is what I really got stalled in the series. After the third book was so fast-paced and so exciting, to just have to stop for 700 pages, 800 pages, and not do anything just drove me nuts. And I took a long break when I was reading this one from completing the series because I got bored of it, and I had to pick it back up and get back into it again. And as I said, in book 6 is when I really started regaining my interest in the series again. But yeah, book 4 and 5 is really, it feels like he's just treading water, trying to figure out how to finish the series. So that's really a weak point, I think. But books 2, 3, 6, and 7, and to a certain extent the first one, are all very exciting. So my advice is, if you're going to read it, press through the first one. You may not be totally engaged with it. You may not really get it yet, but just read it and put it aside, and then you move on to the second one. And I think you'll like the second one a lot better because it's a much better book. Now, of course, the main question you have to ask when reading a series like this that's very long, it's a huge time commitment, is it going to be worth it in the end? Is the ending going to be a letdown? Is it going to be a disappointment? Or am I going to feel like I wasted my time? Or am I going to feel like I enjoyed it and it was worthwhile? I can't answer that for you. I can only tell you how I feel. I know a lot of people probably didn't like this ending, but I think it ended, and I don't really want to spoil it. I don't want to say anything about the ending, but for me, it ended in the only way it could have ended, and I was completely satisfied with the ending. Very happy with it. So I can understand why other people would not like the ending and feel let down by it, but I didn't feel that way. I thought it was well worth my time reading. I've read some other series that I've abandoned because I've gotten bored with them and thought they weren't going anywhere. I never finished Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. I read about 5 books into that, and I just got disgusted with it and thought it wasn't going anywhere. And so this one, I was really happy to have a satisfying conclusion, and I really think it ended well. I think he ended it the only way he could have. So do I recommend The Dark Tower to other readers? I definitely do. If you like long quest stories, if you like epic fantasy, if you like Stephen King in general, if you like stories that are a little bit experimental and genre twisting and bending and maybe pushing the boundaries of fiction a little bit, it's definitely worth reading. And you've got to push through books 4 and 5 because they're a bit dull, but I thought it was well worth it. I'm really glad that I read it. I have it under my belt now, and I can, know when other people are talking about it. I know what they're talking about. So it's certainly one of my favorite things that Stephen King has done, and I'm glad I read it. So I would recommend it for you guys as well. If you want a long project that's going to take you about a year to finish, or it took me a year, it'll probably take you less time because I paused quite a bit in the middle. Definitely worth a read. So that's my review of the Dark Tower series. It's been a long time coming, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Leave me a comment down below and let me know what you thought of the Dark Tower series, or if you have any questions about it, I'd be happy to engage with you. I always try to answer my comments when I can. And I'll catch you next time. Thanks so much.